get a better understanding of the evolving China-Africa partnership, this is China-Africa Talk. Africa is home to some of the world's richest renewable energy resources. Yet more than 600 million people still live without access to electricity. From abundant sunshine and powerful rivers to vast wind and geothermal potential, the continent has no shortage of clean energy. The real challenge is turning that potential into reliable, affordable, and accessible power. Welcome to this edition of China-Africa Talk. I'm Gao Junya. In this co-production of CGTN Africa and Kenya Television Network, KTN, Zawadi Mudibo and Douglas Akwaj join KTN anchor Dennis Aseto to examine Africa's energy paradox and explore what it will take for the continent to achieve greater energy security and independence.
Africa finds itself at very interesting times because with what we see happening in the Middle East, Africa is constantly asking itself, what are some of the solutions we have? It's been said we enjoy sun pretty much throughout the year, but are we tapping in such solutions that we do have? Talk about wind energy, talk about solar, talk about hydro. But where do you think we are in terms of energy independence? Zawadi?
Well, that's a very broad sort of focus area. But what I will tell you is energy, and I know we're going to be speaking about a specific component of electricity, but energy is broadly what powers life. Look at how you move in the house, how you get out of your house to work, how you go about your duties, and you can basically not distance yourself from energy in any sphere of your life. It could be the car that you drive or commute with to work. It could be the food that you eat. It could be the hospital that you visit. It could be the training you get at school. It could be the laptop you're working on. All these components that we use in our day-to-day life have to be powered. And so energy is part of life, I would say.
Douglas, energy is part of life.
Yeah, of course, energy is part of life, an essential element, an essential requirement in life. Of course, when things happen like they are doing right now, the crisis in the Middle East, for me as a journalist who has covered these issues now for almost slightly over 10 years, I prefer to talk about what I can call the paradox of plenty when it comes to Africa.
Yeah.
The paradox of plenty, because on the one hand, and this is always about a crisis, when these things happen, on the one hand, we lament, our situation, but on the other hand, we have everything. We have sun, we have wind, we have geothermal, we have hydro. I'm told there is a river in the DR Congo, sorry about the conflict that is going on there, that can actually power the whole of Africa using a hydro. So as we always talk about this crisis, when there's conflict in a different part of the world and it affects Africa the way it does today, we always are woken up to this contradiction, which I call, the paradox of plenty. Yes.
You see, when you talk about the paradox of the plenty, is fact that you look at the continent with around 1 billion plus people, right? But you find that 600 million of their billion people do not have access to electricity. And with all the plenty that you talk about, I mean, you could even go further to some of the resources that the West is tapping. Talk about uranium that we have in abundance, where others are using that for nuclear energy. But you have all this, but still 600 million people, that is close to half the population we have in the continent, still don't have access to electricity. And with that, then, as we ask the question, why are we finding it difficult to tap on these resources for us to say we are providing for the communities?
There's always need to invest in any resource that you want. And when you talk about energy, for example, the International Energy Agency has said that Africa requires at least $190 billion every year between 2026 and 2030 to be able to generate enough power or to meet its energy requirement. So imagine how much of that $190 billion is raised or is invested in energy across the continent. We barely do even half of it. So that means there has to be a deliberate measure between government, private sector, and all development partners that work towards ensuring that Africa is energy sufficient or energy independent, to invest and to be able to help Africa harness this energy. Like Douglas has said, there's vast amounts of renewable, clean energy options available to Africa. Geothermal, for example, Kenya is one of the biggest producers of geothermal in the world, not just in Africa, probably top 3 or top 5 in the world. And then you look at hydro. We have, the tropical forests in the DRC, a lot of water flowing through with very good pressure that allows generation of power. Then think about wind energy, think about solar energy, think about bioenergy. There's so much available to us as Africa. So we have the resource. We haven't invested enough to tap into that resource.
What will it take for us to invest in it?
Yeah, again.
What must we do?
Again, old script, same conversation. I don't know whether it's in teaching, we call it moving from the known to the known. Moving from the known to the known, or moving. You usually should be moving from the known to the unknown. And I'll tell you why it's moving from the known to the known. First of all, I think we need money. We need cash. We need funds. Yeah, because, to tap into these resources, to convert these resources into energy, we need money. But it's the old problem again of, so where do we get the money from? We have to borrow the money. And I'm told by experts like Mudibo here, who's a business journalist, that, the risk perception, that if you give Africa money, it's like putting your money in a place where there are den of lions, The risk perception means the cost of finance is very high compared to other parts of the world. So if we want to borrow, to invest in tapping this huge potential, the money comes with a high cost. So that's one, which is known, which is a conversation we've had endlessly. For me, the issue here is how do we reduce this risk perception? I think the responsibility sometimes lies even with media like us, the way the rest of the world sees Africa. So that's one problem we need to deal with. I think the other one is, again, the old story of grids, transmission lines, which are old and are falling apart. So while we may have some of this energy, some of this power, to move it from point A to point B is a grid problem. So we need also to address that. Of course, the old, again, story about Africa and resources, and the thing about corruption, where we borrow money and put it in the wrong places. So governance issues. So this power sector, this energy sector is bedeviled with governance issues. Of course, also when we talk about this figure, Dennis, I wonder, when does it change? It's 10, 15 years covering these issues. I was told that the people who don't have access to electricity in Africa are 600 million. 10 years later, there are 600 million. Yet I hear of last mile, what is it called? Last mile project. So this deliver nothing. I do not believe this figure. I think a lot is also going on that is changing the landscape, the energy landscape in Africa, which the media and other development partners who work on these reports either fail or inadvertently leave out, But of course, also, I think there is also the problem of looking at Africa as a country. An old story. I agree that we have a problem of political instability, of conflicts. So while some parts of Africa are speeding, developing in terms of this energy conversion into what we can use, like Mudibo said, it's part of our life, others remain behind because of conflict. And of course, I think we will need subsidies. Business journalists, when they hear about subsidies,
they know what it means.
It raises a red flag. But this sector must be subsidized for it to move.
I think that the most important, the missing link in sorting out Africa's energy issue is basically investment, and tied to that investment is perception. When you talk about risk, you cannot measure risk in absolute terms. but it is about the perception that is created towards the ability of loaning or lending to Africa and getting that money paid within the agreed amount of time. Now
So Zawadi, just to jump in there, maybe if you allow me, who creates this perception?
And I was going to your question. So you talked about the role of the media, and I completely agree with you. The media has a big role to report Africa accurately, but also we have other levels of perception creation, such as the organizations that decide or that determine what you'll say is the credit worthiness of African institutions or African governments. None of those organizations that are globally renowned are domiciled in Africa or are Africa-led.
That's true.
And that is one of the major problems.
Did we start our own credit rating agency?
The African Union wanted to do that. The African
we started
Union,
our own credit rating agency.
Yes, the African Union is leading that conversation. But then beyond the African Union, you must have all these multilateral institutions like the African Development Bank using that credit rating to loan money so that then it becomes a practical instrument. But there are also other levels of clearance for it to be accepted as an international meeting certain international standards to be rolled out on large scale. That is a conversation that needs to take place.
I mean, one thing that I think so far we've gathered is the African story, or even when it comes to financial architecture, is decided outside the continent.
They are foreign.
And with that, then Africa finds itself very difficult to initiate projects that would solve the African problem. So with the African Union and Africa Development Bank then jumping in to try find solutions to these, even African presidents, President William Ruto pushing for the architecture to change, for terms and conditions for African governments as well to change. One asks the question, as the media, our responsibility is to tell the African story, because the African story has for a very long time been told by the West, right? And with that in mind, especially with the resources that we do have, is it that African governments can't put their heads together to find a solution to this? Or is it that everyone is busy looking at problems internally, that thinking about Africa's energy independence as African Union is something that is put on the side?
Well, I would say that the bureaucratic nature of these processes is in itself very self-defeating, because if you have conversations, when we've had very good conversations, we have very good proposals to policies, and then the implementation is where now things get stuck. And it depends with how one government or one country perceives the other. I think there's a trust deficit across the continent. But we have a role as media to really report correctly and sometimes, I dare say, positively about the continent, because it is only this kind of reporting that is going to be available to the rest of the world to understand Africa as we experience it. If you talk about Africa being a place of conflict, being a place of, bad governance, we've had worse places across the world with worse conflict, with worse governance. Yet there is massive investments going on. Yet we don't see that kind of response in Africa. And also our leaders, sometimes they don't do much to help the situation. When you steal resources, as is talked about corruption, you steal resources and then you put that money in a Swiss account, or you put it somewhere in an offshore account. What are you telling those people about the continent? You don't even trust your financial institutions. And then you expect these very people that have built that financial system that you trust to come and invest in your continent. So they begin to ask, if these guys cannot even trust their own banks and they're bringing money to us, why should we give them money? Why should we invest in them? So there's a lot of governance and trust issues that our leaders need to sort out. But there is still a lot of opportunity. I think Africa has over 60% of the required resource for clean energy, and specifically solar. But it's only about 1%. that has been tapped.
Before you move on to the next issue, I wanted to weigh in on the issue of the collective. It's a point, it's something you are raising through the question you are asking. And I think as a collective, Africa does well up to a point.
Yeah.
And I believe the idea of Africa's energy independence is an aspiration that is covered, that is well captured in Africa Agenda 2063. I think which also has got timelines. When we talk about energy independence, we talk about energy sovereignty, particularly within a backdrop of massive resources that we have. Then the question of financing, like we are raising here, then should make us think about alternatives, because multilateral lenders, particularly Western-based multilateral lenders, have, as already been pointed out, perceive Africa through a lens of risk, and then therefore their money is costly. But then does that mean that Africa doesn't have alternatives? I think it does, particularly within the context of South-South cooperation, BRICS, other international lenders that are not Western-based. These are options that are that exist for Africa. And then, of course, the regional approach. The idea of the regional approach and the idea of comparative advantage. Look at this region, the East African region. I mean, if you may include Ethiopia here. And just look at that grand Renaissance dam and the capacity of power that it generates. Then you wonder, should it be more about finding out how that energy, the transmission, the cost, how can we buy it? How can we then transmit it to other parts of the region? As opposed to each one of us, in the face of particularly diminishing water resources because of climate change, we want to focus on hydro. That is just giving an example, that a regional approach. And I had this in our discussion on energy, in our town hall last time on energy, when the panelists, the experts there were talking about regional approaches to solving this energy problem. So yes, in my view, I think Africa as a collective has a vision under Vision 2063. And Africa does have alternatives. And Africa is also pushing the idea of regional approaches to this energy solution. So I think give and take, we are heading there.
We're heading there.
Yes,
when we actually head there is now what is debatable.
The
The implementation of the same, right? But let's dive into the alternatives, right? And let's focus on solar. Everybody always travels to the continent. Why? Because of its sun. Everybody comes here to enjoy our Masai Mara, our beaches, because it is accompanied with the sun. But what are we doing with that sun? Is it just that it is so sunny we want to be indoors? Is it because it is so sunny that we're not seeing what exactly we do have? Would you reckon that the African government, as a people, we've started seeing the potential there is in solar, the potential there is in terms of getting into R&D and tapping that as a possible solution because it is with us 367 days?
Yeah. And if I may, I think there is no doubt. We can't sit here and debate about abundance. Yeah, because it's a given. It's a given. It's obvious. It's there for all of us to see. So the question then is, how do we convert that abundance to reality? Harnessing, tapping that energy from the sun and converting it into energy that then we use on a gadget like this sitting in front of my mouth, you know. So there is no doubt that there is abundance. And of course, there is also no doubt that compared to grid electricity, this is something you deploy. I think you buy a panel, put it on top of your roof, wire it up, and choop, you are gone. So even the ease of deployment makes a case for solar. Then, of course, it takes us away from the bureaucracy. And I don't know, Zawadi maybe as an expert might want to unpack that a bit for us. You know, it is off-grid. The issue has always been grid and the bureaucracies that go with grid. You know, the policy, the micromanagement, the governmental micromanagement, if I may, because grid, you don't own the grid, but you own the solar. So even that is really, really obvious, you know. And then the cost implication. It's just cheap. It's abundant.
Is it though?
It does. It is. I think the initial investment, as maybe Zawadi, you can go there. The initial investment may
that
be
is where rubber meets the road.
And that is where the problem is, because you have this resource in plenty. You have the sunlight, you have the wind, for example. But for you to convert that resource into usable energy at home, is a very capital intensive venture. And that is where now we have initiatives like what the African Development Bank is trying to do and has been doing since 2024, launched what is called the Africa 300, the countdown to connecting or electrifying 300 million homes across the continent by the year 2030. Last month, a report by the World Bank indicated that at least 50 million homes in 40 African countries had been connected. That is quite significant looking at the pace at which it has happened. And this has happened because there's a lot of private sector involvement. There's also support from non-governmental organizations and development partners. And they've created a framework that allows African multilateral institutions to invest directly. And that's why you're seeing foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation committing over $100 million into this project. But then how do you scale that up? That is where now we need a lot of resource investment and distribution, particularly at the level of governments. In Kenya or Nigeria, these are countries that are heavily reliant on power as they try to industrialize. South Africa has industrialized through massive fossil fuels, the coal mines and all these kind of things. And they have gone ahead to try and set up the nuclear power generation capacity. Unless we look at investment in renewable energy and in clean energy, then we will continue to have a problem with access, we'll continue to have a problem with power distribution. And like I said, power is not just power, it is the hospital services, it is the transport services, it's the education, it is the jobs we do.
True.
I mean, without power, we will not be able to have this conversation and have these gadgets transmitting sound, light and everything else. So it is something that needs a lot of deliberate effort and a lot of commitment from policy to regulation to roll out.
I will tell you one thing for a fact, that even this power we're enjoying here is actually solar. So I think we're leading here. So Douglas, if I will take you for a tour
of the building to admire.
But you see, when we talk about solar and setting it up, for us to turn that solar into electricity, there's the panel that you have to buy. How much is a panel as we talk today? For that panel as well to make sense, you must have storage, where then is the batteries. And in Kenya today, if you wanted to set it up for your home, would be around $5,000 or something.
$5,000.
That's around
slightly over
$500,000.
half a million.
Yeah. For you to set up a system that is able to run your home, run your equipment and everything else. And for global south countries, that is a lot of investment for a single household. So then one asks the question, where we also have all the resources in the continent that we need to produce lithium batteries, right? Are we seeing any movement towards then that technology transfer, especially when we're working with other governments, that technology transfer for us to produce our own batteries in the continent, for us perhaps to even go with the production of the solar panels in the continent, as well as even going further and incentivizing those in that space so that it's cheaper and affordable? Or are we still staying at the government bureaucracy level? Because in Kenya today, you want to install solar, you're told you need someone who's going to school and you need $1 million bob for you to set up. So are we shooting ourselves in the foot when we say we don't have power, right? We need to connect people, but you're making it very expensive for many to connect.
Yeah. Actually, the issue about solar and the connection between cheap energy and looking at African households, I think is mass discussion.
Yeah.
I just wanted us to digress a little on the burden, the cost, the burden of energy on traditional African households. We find that maybe a household budget, may take out about up to 20% just to spend on energy.
Tokens expensive.
Yeah, tokens are very expensive. And I was wondering to a colleague again today whether you understand that there are shops where you can go and actually borrow a token.
Borrow?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure.
Okay.
That you can borrow and pay. That you can borrow.
Someone has got to pay for it before you borrow.
Yeah, but the point I'm trying to make here is that the concern, the worry about energy then begins to crowd out other, domestic use, essentials. When you worry too much about energy, when you worry too much about power, then probably you begin to think less about rent.
Yeah.
You begin to think less about nutritious food.
School fees.
You begin to think less about hospital bill. So dealing with that power bill can be a big relief for families. So this energy poverty, the impact of energy poverty in African households is something that we need to understand. And of course, you see now the survival, it pushes families into a survival sort of mode where probably there is a meal to cook, but there is no power to cook it. So these are the realities, and I think this is the wake-up call that African governments should have, the burden at the domestic level, at the domestic household level for energy. You direct all resources to energy, and then you deny other equally essential aspects of life, the need for these resources. And then, of course, the alternative, when people cannot get clean energy, if we cannot get grid power, if we cannot get solar power, then people resort to survival mode, to survival alternatives. Then we still scramble for firewood. Dried rural African communities, dried cow dung, kerosene, which is smoky and toxic, because it is the cheapest, when you talk about industrial fuel. And these alternatives are also linked to diseases, health concerns. So for me, the urgency that exists, that may require that governments do something very quickly about this. And it lies for me in partnerships. Of course, technology transfer is always an issue. I don't think anybody gives you their technology freely, but through partnerships. Yeah. I think particularly in the area of solar, and already I think across many African countries, these partnerships are there, where assembling of solar panels, and the little connectivity gadgets that go with that panel is already happening. Now, through these partnerships, through this co-creation of products, then that technology will filter down into Africa. But my view really is that the question of domestic energy is very urgent for families in Africa. Yes.
Yeah. I think we also have seen a number of countries that have gone ahead to invest heavily and immensely in renewable energy, specifically solar. If you look at Morocco, for example, there's a bit of work going on even in Kenya and South Africa. There are some good spots of investments going on, but this is a skilled area, like you've said. Yeah. So you need the skill, and we need to begin to think about how do we build that capacity, how do we build that skill set for the sake of generations to come. I just wanted to ask you, Dennis, as a journalist, Douglas, you've heard of this term armchair journalism. Yeah. Journalists who do not want to put in the work and they want to regurgitate what other journalists have done and look good, right? And so you can see there's lack of depth in what they do and lack of depth in their reportage. I dare say we have a lot of armchair governance in Africa, where you have policymakers, presidents, people in positions of power, instead of implementing or creating policy that are curated to their countries, they are waiting to go to another COP to discuss issues, yet they can't even have a voice as African countries. Ask those African governments, they go to these meetings and they have fragmented agendas. Now, why don't you take these fragmented agendas back to your countries and implement? If Kenya thinks this is the direction we need to take as Africa, then can Kenya do exactly that in the country Kenya? So that then you come to the next COP and say, this is what we have done, not this is what we want done. And I think this is where we are going to get it right. But unless we have deliberate governance issues sorted out, we will continue. And the people who have made a life, especially in government, the people who have made a life out of just traveling to conferences and making money because of per diem and
Sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Sounds familiar.
There are people who literally just do this, and they don't
Mm.
really care about what impact they're leaving in society.
Yeah.
But I'm really encouraged, folks, particularly on the issue of schools.
Yeah.
How they
600
are
schools.
using solar
Yeah.
to transform the way they cook meals for students at school. Moving away from biomass, tons of biomass, which is a pollutant in itself, tons of wood. You heard him talk about even parents bringing firewood to school. So I think this is really, really good progress. And if I could, I would have asked if this benefit is spreading to other areas, because my thoughts also go to, students who cannot study, students who cannot read or complete their homework because dusk has set in. It has become night.
Yeah, I think the same way Africa must come out and find its own solutions. We don't have an option. We have to find these solutions because nobody is coming outside this continent to solve our problems. And the earlier we get that, then those in governance, policymakers will start looking at, when they attend these COPs, what exactly are they going to say? Because remember, even when we had the very first Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi, it was being held in the continent for the first time, and still we were fragmented on decisions that came out of Nairobi Declaration. So by the time we were saying we're using Nairobi agenda to go to the next COP, which was I think COP 27 or 28, still
the one in Dubai.
Still we did not speak in one voice. So there is a lot that the continent must do. We have the resources. We just must put our heads together and find solutions that will benefit the kawaida kawaida, that will benefit the citizens of the continent. Because at the end of the day, why are you in power? To serve the people. In closing remarks, gentlemen, where are we as a continent in a minute each?
It's a mixed bag for me. It's a mixed bag. I think the problem with Africa is that sometimes we make many steps forward and then we make some steps backwards.
Yeah.
But for me, the key takeaway in this discussion, and which I think needs to be carried forward, is the need for Africa. The need for Africa to speak with one voice. When we scatter our voices, when we pursue different paths in pursuit of one single goal, then we will be lost. So I think Africa must speak with one voice on the issue of energy, and must pursue one path on this particular issue.
So Adi?
I believe that solar alone cannot solve Africa's power or electricity problems. But there's also the opportunity for every African country to identify what is uniquely in abundance in terms of resource, whether it's wind, it's geothermal, it's solar, and invest in that to be able to then clean up its grid. And specifically also to invest in capacity building. Let's have technical vocational training institutions around the continent, challenging students around STEM to come up with innovative solutions towards powering their homes, powering their businesses, so that then these best examples that are going to be found can be scaled up in communities and in urban centers and in at the country level and regionally, so that then Africa begins to experience utilizing its own solutions.
Yeah. I look at energy solutions in the continent, and I have to look at it in terms of, unfortunately, we don't even have a continent solution when it comes to nuclear power. Everything else is decided out of the continent. So Africa Union, what are we doing to having a common position towards having nuclear energy? Because we also can't afford not to talk about energy independence and not talk about energy mix that we have in our communities as well. So what are we doing with the different forms of energy that we do have? I think conversation must continue.
Africa has no shortage of energy resources. The challenge is turning that potential into affordable, reliable power through investment, innovation, and stronger regional cooperation. Partnerships, including with China, in areas such as financing, technology, and renewable energy will also be key to helping Africa power its future. That's it for this edition of China-Africa Talk. Subscribe to our program on major podcast platforms and on Substack to get a better understanding of the evolving China-Africa partnership. I'm Gao Junya. Bye for now.